Aldous Penn had worked the front corridor of the Hartwell Charitable Clinic for 34 years, and in that time he had learned to read a room the way a sailor reads weather, by the small signs, before the change arrived. He had learned which footsteps meant a patient turning, which meant a family bearing news, and which, from the moment the front door opened, meant that Silas Wren had come in from the street. That last one needed no special learning. A man did not so much hear Silas Wren arrive as feel the corridor rearrange itself around him, the nurses straightening, the waiting room settling into a different quality of quiet, the junior staff finding something to occupy their hands. Not because he demanded it. He never demanded anything. It was simply that the Hartwell, to anyone who understood it clearly, was Silas Wren's house, and every person in it knew what they owed to the fact that it stood at all. Men with dock injuries, women with children who had coughed through the night, older people who had nowhere else they could afford to go. They came to the Hartwell because the Hartwell would see them, and the Hartwell would see them because Silas Wren had built it for that purpose, and kept it whole through 2 recessions and a flood and a city council that had at various points tried to reclassify the building and quietly encourage the neighborhood to become something more profitable. None of those efforts had succeeded. Penn had watched all of them fail from the front desk, and he had noticed, each time, that the failure involved very little noise from Mr. Wren's direction and a great deal of sudden silence from everyone else. This was the nature of the man's power. It was in the certainty, which every person who dealt with him arrived at individually and usually quite quickly, that Silas Wren did not bluff, did not negotiate from weakness, and did not forget. He was a man in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and dark, steady eyes that had a way of waiting for you to finish speaking before they told you what they had understood. He dressed plainly, dark suit, no flourish, and he ran the clinic from a small back office with a desk, a shelf of records, and a single window looking onto the rear courtyard. The morning the thing with Edith Moss began, though Penn only understood later that it had begun, was a Tuesday in March, cold and gray, with a slow drizzle that had been coming down since before dawn. Penn was restocking the linen cart near the supply room at the end of the back corridor when he heard her coat move in the close space, and a small folded paper fell from her pocket to the flagstone floor. She did not notice. She was already moving, a stack of pressed sheets over one arm, heading toward the East Ward. Penn picked the paper up. He meant only to return it to her. He did not mean to look at it. But the paper unfolded slightly as he lifted it, and the number at the bottom was large enough that his eye caught it before his propriety could intervene, and then he looked more carefully because the number did not make sense in the context of what he knew a laundress at the Hartwell earned in a week. It was a receipt from Pharaoh's Linen and Supply on Merchant Street, 4 dozen cotton draw sheets, 2 dozen pillowcases, a gross of hand towels. The date was 6 weeks prior. The name at the top was not the clinic's, it was hers. Penn stood in the corridor for a long moment, the receipt in his hand, the drizzle audible against the high, narrow window. Then he went to the supply room and opened the linen cupboard and looked at what was inside, and at the logbook on the hook beside it, and then he went back to the records room and found the clinic's supply accounts for the past 3 years, which he had access to in his capacity as senior porter, and he sat down and read them carefully. By the time he was finished, the cold in the records room had worked its way through his jacket. He had a list of 9 dates across 37 months during which the clinic's linen allocation had been short of what the wards needed, and during every one of which, according to the supply log, the linen cupboard had somehow remained adequately stocked. He had a second list of the precise months the shortfalls had occurred. The 2 lists matched exactly. Edith Moss had been at the Hartwell for 3 years and 4 months. She was a widow in her early 30s, quiet-spoken, methodical, who had appeared one February morning with a reference from the Dennard Hostel laundry and asked if there was work. Penn had processed her intake himself. She lived in a single room on Calder Street and worked a second half-day on Thursdays at a private house on the hill to make the rent. She had, as far as Penn had observed in 3 years, never once mentioned to anyone that the linen cupboard had been short, never once asked to be reimbursed for anything, and never appeared to think she had done anything worth remarking upon, because the linen cupboard had always been full when the wards needed it, and that was simply the way a clinic ought to run. Penn sat with this knowledge for one full day before he took it anywhere. He was not a man who acted on the first feeling a thing produced in him. The first feeling this produced was something close to grief, the simple, clean grief of a man who has worked somewhere for 34 years and suddenly understands that the place contained a goodness he had been walking past without seeing. The second feeling, which arrived in the evening at his kitchen table, was the plain certainty that Silas Wren should know. He went to the back office the following morning and knocked and waited and went in when called, and he set the 2 lists and the receipt on the desk, and stood back and told Silas Wren what he had found, and where, and how, and over how long a period. Wren read the lists. He read the receipt. He turned the receipt over and looked at the back of it, which was blank, and then he set it down. Penn had seen the man go still before at bad news, at a decision of weight, at the 2 or 3 moments in 34 years when something had genuinely reached him. This stillness was different. This was the stillness of a man confronted with something he did not have a category for, and who was too honest to pretend otherwise. The room was quiet for long enough that Penn heard the drizzle start up again against the window. Then Wren said, "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday morning," Penn said. "You're certain of the dates?" "I am." Wren nodded once, the way he nodded when a thing was settled. He looked at the receipt again. Then he said, "Thank you, Aldous," which was the first time in 34 years he had used Penn's given name, and Penn understood that he was dismissed and went. He did not see Wren for the rest of that morning. He heard from the cook that the back office had been empty since 9. He heard from the junior nurse who managed the East Ward that someone had come through the corridor around 10:30, not a patient, not a visitor, walking toward the supply room. The junior nurse had not looked up from her chart in time to see who it was. Penn saw the back corridor himself at 11:30, and he saw Silas Wren standing in the doorway of the supply room. Not inside it. In the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, not quite entering. And inside, with her back to the door and entirely unaware that she had company, Edith Moss was folding sheets with the efficient, unhurried precision Penn had observed in her 100 times. The sheets going corner to corner, smoothed flat, stacked without excess motion, as though the right way to do a thing were simply the way it wanted to be done. Penn stopped at the end of the corridor and did not move. He saw Wren watch her for a moment, not more than that, and without the quality of someone who did not wish to be noticed. There was nothing concealed about it. It was the look of a man who has been told something true and is confirming it with his own eyes, because he is the kind of man who confirms things himself. Then Wren stepped through the doorway into the supply room, and Penn heard him say her name. She turned. Penn could not see her face from where he stood, but he saw her go still in the same way that Wren himself had gone still the morning before, and he thought, so that is what it looks like from the outside. What Wren said, Penn heard only in pieces. He was not close enough for more. He heard the words 3 years spoken plainly and without embellishment. He heard "I understand," which in Wren's voice carried the particular weight of a man for whom understanding was not a courtesy but a fact. He heard a silence of some length, and then he heard Edith Moss say something he could not make out in a voice that was even and composed, and then he heard Wren speak again, and this time the words were clear because Wren was not a man who softened what he meant into inaudibility. "I'm asking you to stay, not as you are, as the person who runs this household with a salary that reflects it. There is no condition attached to the question." Penn held himself very still in the corridor. The silence that followed was long enough that Penn counted 11 of his own heartbeats before Edith Moss spoke. Her voice was quiet and clear. She said, "Then I would like to hear what the position requires." Penn heard Silas Wren say, "I was hoping you would ask that." And then Penn turned and walked back down the corridor toward the front desk, because he was a man who understood the difference between witnessing and watching, and the rest of it was not his to see. Penn stood at the front desk for a while. The waiting room was half full, a man with his arm in a makeshift sling, a mother with a small girl asleep across her lap, two older men sitting side by side without speaking, in the comfortable silence of people who had known each other long enough that speech was optional. The drizzle had softened to a fine mist, and the morning light through the front windows was almost gentle. Penn thought about 34 years. He thought about the things that hold a place like the Hartwell together, the funding never certain, the staff who leave, the council that watches and waits, the small daily repairs that never end. He had always understood those things as the structure of the place, the skeleton. He thought now that he had perhaps been looking at the wrong thing. Skeletons are only the frame. What makes a house is what moves quietly through it without asking to be thanked. He had walked past Edith Moss 4 times a day for 3 years. He had noticed, in an unexamined way, that the linen corridor was always in order, that supplies appeared without fuss, that the East Ward nurses never complained about shortfalls as they had in earlier years. He had filed all of this under things running as they should. He thought about it now. Around noon, he heard footsteps from the back corridor, Wren's, unhurried, coming toward the front. Wren paused at the desk. His dark eyes were steady, and there was something in his face Penn recognized after a moment as ease, not relaxation, which was not a word that had ever suited Sela's Wren, but something adjacent to it. A man whose shoulders had arrived quietly at a decision he found correct. "She'll have an answer for me by Thursday," Wren said. Penn nodded. "I'll see that the household ledger is ready for her to look at." Something moved at the corner of Wren's mouth, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one, held back out of long habit. "That would be useful," he said. And then he went through the front door and down the step into the pale, wet street, and Penn watched him go. Thursday, Edith Moss gave her answer. Penn was at the front desk when she came through the corridor at 8:30 and knocked on the door of the back office and went in when called, and he did not hear what was said because the door was closed, and neither of them were people who raised their voices. She was inside for perhaps 12 minutes. When she came out, she walked back down the corridor with the same unhurried precision she brought to folding sheets, not hurrying, not looking around, attending to the thing in front of her. And as she passed the front desk, she caught Penn's eye and gave him a small, direct nod, the nod of a person who has settled a question to her own satisfaction. Penn gave her the same in return. He thought about that nod for the rest of the day. He thought about the 34 years of his own tenure, and the things he had seen come and go in this building, and the things that had stayed. He thought about what it cost a person to give 3 years of their own wages to a place without asking for acknowledgement, and what it cost a different kind of person to accept that gift by learning of it entirely by accident, and then walking back through their own house and standing in a doorway, and then stepping through and saying plainly what they had come to say. He reached for his own word for it, the way he sometimes did at the end of a long day when something had happened that seemed to ask for one. The word he found was solid, not easy, not sudden, not the kind of thing that burns bright and fades. Solid, built from what people actually were in the hours when they thought no one was looking. That Aldous Penn decided, putting on his coat at the end of his shift and setting his chair straight against the desk in the way he had done for 34 years, was precisely the kind of thing worth building a house around.